This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with the Director of Performance for OL Reign, Andrew Wiseman. He discusses session design in order to help physical adaptations, how they manage individual development plans and athlete goals, as well as his current PhD research. I hope you enjoy. First of all, Andrew, really appreciate you jumping on obviously St. Patrick's Day. We've gone a little bit back and forth. How are things your end? Are you safe and well out in the US?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Firstly, thanks for inviting me on. I'm always honoured to be asked to come on to podcasts. So thank you very much. Everything's going well here. We're just obviously St. Patrick's Day today, but the players have a day off today, and we're just waiting for everyone to come back in tomorrow. We're due to start our games in the next 3 to 4 weeks for the NWSL Challenge Cup. So it's a little period where we can just, after the 6 weeks of pre-season that we've had, we're just relaxing the players and getting ready for the tournament and the season that's up and coming. But generally things are good here, out here in Washington State. With the COVID situation, things have got a lot better. So it's encouraging.
Perfect. So I guess to start with, for people that might not necessarily know you or know your background, you just want to talk through, I guess, what your current role is and where you're based. And then I guess give a little summary in terms of how you may have got there and some, I guess, highlight stops along the way.
Yeah, sure. So currently my title is Director of Performance for OL Reign here in Tacoma in Washington, playing in the NWSL. I joined here the end of December, so quite new here. They'd look to restructure their performance or health and performance, as we call it, areas with myself and the Director of Rehab, plus some other staff that we've recruited, with a psychologist, nutritionist, an athletic trainer and a masseur. Plus we also have a chiropractor and various other staff that we work with. So I was asked, I took on this role, and before that I was at Utah Royals in Salt Lake City. So I came to the US in 2019. I joined the Royals, who unfortunately aren't anymore. But I was attracted. I was at Exeter City just before that, and before that I was at Celtic and in Charlton and Stevenage. But I remember the 2019 Women's World Cup, and obviously the USA are well known as being the best team in the world. And myself and the players do talk about it, how the European women's game is they're catching up. There's teams catching up, but I remember I wasn't working at the time, and I turned to my mum, and we were watching the USA, and I said to her, if a job came up in the US, especially in the women's game, I would take it. And she said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Yeah." And this job came up. The Royals came up, and I didn't want to turn it down. So that brought me to the USA. Before that, as I said, I spent a season with Exeter City, down there in Devon, League Two, very much different to what I'd been used to, because I'd gone there from Celtic, where I worked with the women and the International Academy there. So it was very different, but a real learning experience, because when you see the facilities that I've maybe become accustomed to, and then you go to a great club like Exeter, brilliant people there, where you have to think on your feet a lot. And I think I was their first ever full-time sports scientist stroke strength and conditioning coach. So I had a clue in the title there that there was an awful lot to be done. But we built a gym, and I had some real positive influences, in the role that I had there. Working with the physios and sports therapists to try and build a performance environment. My academic background is, I was really lucky. The first degree was part funded by the PFA. and then I finished that degree. Well, actually, no, that's not strictly true. I stopped that degree because I was living in Ireland at the time and playing and coaching over there. And I was like, do you know what? I can't deal with this. And then I came back to the UK and got another severe injury. And I thought I was really interested in my rehab. And so I went back to Manchester Met and I said, well, what do you think about me coming back? And they said, well, you'll probably lose your funding. But so I thought, no, I'm going to do it. And I graduated there with first class honours, which was brilliant because a lot of people on my course were still playing as pros. So it was really good to be in and around that environment. And then I started my PhD in September last year, in a slight change from physiology in organisational psychology, and looking at, at the moment, just investigating the stressors on support staff and looking at that, comparing it with the stresses that players go through. So it's obviously a long project, and maybe my question is changing quite a lot, but something I'm really enjoying.
Nice. I think we'll definitely touch on that again, because I think it'd be interesting to kind of hear the research you've done so far around that area. I think a good starting point now will be where you are now. So in terms of your current role and what you're currently doing, what does that look like from a day to day? What do you oversee? And I guess what's your aim for the players within your department? What's your vision for those guys that come under your care?
Yeah, so my role is quite unique in some respects there, that I'm sort of positioned between management and coaching, or the coaching staff and management, and what they call the front office here. So a lot of my role is advising or talking to the coaching staff about the sessions, the session plans, working out the physical components of that, advising on, the status of our players from a sort of recovery or fatigue. Shall we say, although fatigue is a very broad area, but we collect data on the players. My job is to interpret that data for the coaches, and whether that be the GPS, the wellness, or some objective measures we use to look at sort of muscular fatigue, and be able to report that to the coaches and say, okay, this session might need modified, or we may have players that have special requirements, and we will modify the sessions for those. And that could be someone at the end stage of their rehab. It could be someone that, has a little bit of an issue, and we just modify things. So one of the overall aims here is to build a performance environment, and the players have been really good, because I think it's easy that they just get a unit thrown on them, a GPS unit, and nothing's ever really explained. It's not uncommon for a player to ask why they're submitting wellness data and doing other things without understanding, what's underpinning it all. So we're very much hands-on here with the players. I also oversee all the sort of strength and conditioning programs for the players as well. And we've just built a new gym area for the players. So mainly, interpreting the data and informing coaches also how the players are responding to training. Was that an easy session for one? Was it maybe not? So, was it difficult for one player? And helping them with the design of sessions to physically get the best out of the players. If, for an example, I was working with 8 players yesterday who are just a little bit behind due to, being away, international duty, or coming back from certain things, or, maybe had a quarantine period that was extended, whatever that was. I was working solely with them to try and get them up to speed physically yesterday. And that was a pitch-based session. So my role is very varied. I'm very much integrated into the coaching staff as to, what they're planning, what they've designed, and then have my input of how we can get the best out of players physically.
So I guess around the data and around the wellness information you're able to gather. Now, I appreciate, obviously, a lot of the actual data itself is going to be confidential, but in terms of metrics that you're able to gather and information that then informs your thinking moving forward, what type of information do you and are you able to gather from the players, and how do you use this in a way to obviously adapt your sessions or adapt their schedule accordingly?
Yeah, so very common practice to use a wellness questionnaire, and that will be mood, stress, fatigue, soreness on a scale of 1 to 5. So what will happen is the players will submit that data, and then the questions that we would ask would be, or when we look at that data, is, if it's soreness, which is part of an adaptation process anyway, but is it unusually high? We have, the statistics we use, we see if they're deviating away from their norms. Is that an issue? Does it need an intervention? We also use objective, like a CMJ, an eccentric hamstring strength, and then we'll be looking at, does that session now need modifying for that player? Based on previous sessions, is there an issue? Is there something that we need to know about? Is there a lifestyle issue? Is there something else that's going on? So I think wellness data is maybe not, I think it's very sensitive to training loads. So you will see trends of like a higher day. Of course, you're going to see, maybe higher soreness and fatigue, maybe some sleep disruptions, especially in pre-season. So we put context to it as to whether, is a result of the session, or is it something that we need to investigate further? So I think wellness data needs to be taken, certainly needs to be looked at maybe with some objective measures, but also, as a conversation starter. And I think that's very much the way we view it. What's causing these issues? On the other side of that, there are days when you would expect someone to report high fatigue and high soreness, so it's not a problem. And it's trying to put that together to understand our athletes better and their responses, because same training session, 2 different players will respond completely differently, and gradually over time we can spot some trends and answer questions of whether this is normal for someone, and then if need be make interventions, whether that be extra physical work or a recovery intervention, whatever it is that we need to do to help the player be at their peak.
And in terms of physiological data that you're able to gather, in terms of what they may do during sessions, etc., obviously you mentioned GPS there. What type of information are you able to gather during sessions or during the workouts that then informs what you're doing moving forward?
Yeah, so we use heart rate, and then we'll use heart rate and RPE. So RPE being a subjective measure, but for us, we will monitor it, and there may be some sessions where we need to be sub-maximal, and we want players to be below a certain heart rate threshold. Some we want to be over that, because we want to stress them. Within that, we also use a heart rate recovery test. So we'll do that approximately once a month, and it's a quick 5-minute run over 25 meters out, 25 meters back. Then they have 2 minutes just to stand still, and we'll observe changes in heart rate dropping, and that gives a good indicator of aerobic fitness and also recovery status. So obviously, the quicker your heart recovers, the fitter you are. In essence, I wouldn't say everything is completely causal. Physiology is incredibly complex, but that's how we'll look at it, and we'll try and understand how the player's responding. Is there something we need to do with that player? So they're the kind of measures we look at within training.
And when you're looking at muscular fatigue that you mentioned earlier on, what tests do you have to be able to see, if people are struggling with muscular fatigue? And I guess moving forward, what you're trying to do is preempt injuries and hopefully either prehab them so it doesn't happen, or give them the subsequent rest that then allows them not to get injured. So what kind of tests, etc., are you putting the players through in order to gain that data?
Yeah, so we use a CMJ, counter movement jump on the force decks. We also look at eccentric hamstring strength, but we'll also do a single leg jump as well. Now, it doesn't take a scientist to work out if there may be a drop in that. In looking at neuromuscular fatigue, if there's a slight drop or outside of their norms, then we can look at that and say, okay, maybe that's what it is. Now, it doesn't really affect if we know the training plan, then we'll be able to say, look, we'll speak to the player, how are they feeling? It could be they're just not it's not their day. I guess it's the use of statistics and statistical insights is we can see how significant that is. If it's, we look at it as over 1.5 standard deviations, it will flag up on our system that maybe we need to look at it a little bit further. But it doesn't, we kind of have a philosophy here that, we need to keep everyone training as much as possible. It's happened a lot over the years that we just end up pulling everyone out. Not saying that we do that, but some sports scientists and some players have told you they're pulling me out every 10 minutes. For us, it's not about that. For us, it's to be able to put the athlete in a safe environment to get the most out of them in training. Rarely do we pull someone out, but we may go back to that coaching, to the coaching staff and say, look, there's quite a lot of significant drops in counter movement jumps. So maybe cut one block off that, block of 4 that you were going to do in this exercise and leave the coaches to make a decision with us. But again, it sounds like I'm using it as an excuse, but it's so complex because everybody responds differently. So I think you have to observe things over time and then try and get informed decisions as to the status of that player at that time. What I think that can lead to is when we go into intense fixtures, we'll be able to see who responds well to maybe 3 games a week, who doesn't, and in some respects influence the coaching staff, to maybe not absolutely fry a player over 3 games in a week, so I think it's very much about those little nudges, those influences, and having informed decision making. But I think the data helps us ask better questions as opposed to give us the answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think what's interesting there is the adaptations you're able to place on sessions, which relate to that, which I think is a really interesting one. Do you want to talk a little bit around how you help generate sessions or adapt sessions within those parameters? And I guess also to discuss what type of physical output you're looking through. And I've said this a few times on my podcast, so some people will be sick of me saying it, but I saw a presentation from Adam Owens, who worked with Chris Coleman a lot, and he did a lot of work and explained a lot around area sizes and how they can adapt and potentially some of the issues that Gareth Bale may have had injury-wise being linked to the type of training that was being done. I think if you look at Eden Hazard at the moment, Zidane's just come out and said he was never injured before he came here. All of a sudden, he's getting injured every other week with us. So that, there's got to be something going on. So for you, in your role, do you want to talk about how you can adapt the sessions and then the kind of considerations you're making with the coaches regarding area sizes or type of sessions or type of repetition of movement, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a great question because Adam's work is great. I've followed a lot of Adam's work. He's also here in Seattle now with the Sounders, so hopefully we'll get a chance to grab a coffee together. But I guess one of what I've used here and what I used at a previous club is small-sided games to get the conditioning. Now, if you manipulate time and space, you'll get different outputs. And I've been talking to the head coach about that today. So if you increase the pitch size and the numbers, you're likely to pick up more high-speed running. Now, there's certain times in the week where you don't want to pick that up excessively. Conversely, when you bring that space size in and the numbers drop, you're looking at more of anaerobic outputs. So what we did was produce a document for the coaches that will give you the dimensions and classified it as small, medium and large. So let's just say a 1v1 small is 10 by 15 meters. Okay. And then we'll say medium would be 15 by, let's just say 15 by 15, and then large could be 20 by 20, just for argument's sake. Within that, then within the sort of document we have, it will tell them what the physical output is. And then there was some research done looking at what the technical and tactical is. So we know that you're probably going to get high volume of shots in that. You're probably not going to get much headers, but you'll get a lot of touches on the ball. And then we do that right the way up to 11v11. So that helps us when we talk with the coach and say, look, if you go with these small-sided games, you're going to get these outputs, which isn't particularly rocket science, but saying that, I sometimes, and I've worked with coaches before, that they're just solely set on playing 11v11. It's like, well, if you keep doing that, then you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. There's, we talk about volume, intensity, session density, but there's also variability. When you go into really intense patterns of play, players need to be able to handle that. And what you'll see is throughout a game, which is something I'm talking to the players about tomorrow, you'll go through these little periods, and then you'll have those 5 or 10 really intense periods where your accels, decels and things like that will be higher because they're, these little passages of play. So they need to be able to handle those demands as well as, opening a pitch up to 11v11. So we've produced quite a few little graphics, some of them based on Adam's work and other authors, to be able to for the coaches to understand that, when we're preparing for a session, for example, the warm-up will be dependent on what they're going to do. So if we know that it's going to be a very small space day, we know we're going to get quite a lot of change of directions, accels, decels, a higher heart rate. We know that the warm-up needs to be in distance shorter, and we'll put in little decels. We might bring the ball in, and we might play the ball in, press the player, little rondos and stuff like that, and manipulate the spaces and time there, so that the players are pretty well prepared for the session that's coming. So that's the way we try to look at it and work with the coaches. Okay, because it's easy to just do, let's say, a 4v4 and a 20x25 and do that every week. I know what we did at Utah was reduce it over 3 weeks. So we would gradually reduce the space over 3 weeks, and then go back around in a sort of cycle. So just a 3-week loading cycle, because space and time will dictate the outputs. One of the biggest things that I speak to coaches about is, the time. If you reduce the time, you're going to reduce the volume. The density and the intensity of the session is different. So, when you have a high intensity, small space day, the players are going to be working pretty hard, but the volume won't be that high, but the intensity is.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept. I know as a player, I used to hate like the 2-hour-long sessions. For me, just being time on feet, by the end of it, I'd be knackered. Equally, I used to hate doing doubles. I'd be fine if I did a session, then a running session before lunch. But after lunch, I used to really struggle with that. But some players loved it. And psychologically, I don't understand why. But then when you look into it more, it's probably to do with body types, your recovery types, all that type of stuff that plays into those factors. In terms of, for you, I imagine part of your role is obviously you're not just going to want to maintain the players over a season. Ideally, you want to be in a position where you can continually improve them and improve them from year to year. How do you manage that around, obviously, essentially you've got to be able to perform on a weekend, or you've got to be able to perform on a Monday or Wednesday night. So how do you manage your needs or wants of putting them in a position where they're constantly improving physiologically, compared to obviously having the performance aspect alongside that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, very difficult, especially in a sport like football, which is chaotic, complex. Every player responds differently to every training session, and games as well. It's heavily, when you look at games, they're heavily influenced by tactics or formations or playing styles, which is where you want to look at it. There's situational factors, red cards or play being held up for whatever reason, injury, whatever, and then you've got to get down to it and say, well, is that player improving? Again, the data helps us to see that it's not linear either. And in season, I think someone once told me that if you're really looking to just maintain in the season, but if you have a drop off of 5 or 10%, you've done quite well, because of the sheer volume of fixtures. Fixtures dictate everything. So that then means that when we look at loading cycles, once all our fixtures are in, where can we get certain windows of opportunity? And I did a presentation last year, or nearly a year ago now. So, and I was talking about that being able to find the windows of opportunity of when to load players, when to, deload them, and when you get them, take those windows of opportunity. And for me, it all depends on a player's game demands as well. Your wingers are going to be, fullbacks now as well. Their outputs will be a lot higher than your forwards or your centre backs. That saying, forwards will probably tend to do a little bit more sprint distance. Your centre backs don't, because they move laterally. They don't get as much high speed running. So that comes into the positional side of things. Are they getting an adequate stimulus across the week? Now, if you compare small-sided games to generic running, you can control the running. You can control the dose that the players get, whatever. I tend to use interval methods, but you can control that. Whereas in small-sided games, you can't control what's going on, and then you can't keep stopping it to say, this person's, doing X amount and it needs to come out. I mean, you could do that if you want, but you're just going to end up doing it all the time. So I think it's us supporting the coaching staff and being flexible in our methods to support them. But that can be, the live monitoring really helps with that. It's not if someone's gone over 50 meters of their high speed running, it's like, okay, fine. 100 meters, whatever it is, what we determine, can the player tolerate that for a start? Are they robust and resilient enough to tolerate it? And then in those following days, how are they responding? And if we can, do we need to modify based on that player? I think sometimes we get too caught up in metrics. I've said a few times, I think it's Goodhart's law that, when a measure becomes a target, it's not a measure anymore. And all GPS does is allow us to measure what somebody's doing in a session, and that helps us make better informed choices. I think if you look at certain models of training, the classic one, probably a little bit more of a British model, is Sunday, Wednesday off for a Saturday game. There's nothing wrong with that. You can get a really good high loading session on a Tuesday. They've got a day off to recover. You probably lose a little bit tactically of the work, because the tactical work tends to come maybe at the end of the week, a Thursday, Friday, and you're into game. Tactical periodization will be different. They might do a game, a recovery day, a day off, and then lead in sort of, maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday for a Saturday game. So I think it depends on, obviously the coach's philosophy is important, and how much you put emphasis on tactical or physical. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way, but there are certain things that you need to adjust. There's certain things you probably wouldn't do on a Thursday, Friday if you got a game on a Saturday. And there has been, I think people have tried to look at that, does it affect performance? I've seen really high loading weeks had an absolute worldie of a performance. I've seen some high loading weeks and be terrible. It's very hard to predict those things. It's hard to predict performance because there's so many things that can influence it. So I think you have to have a really good, ask good questions and look at the insights as to whether things are detrimental to the player. Probably went a bit off topic there, but
no, that's fine. I think that something you've said that's interesting there is the tactical side affecting the physical side. How much does that affect your work? Because I imagine the needs of the players is going to be very different if you're sitting in a low block, Mourinho-esque, as I'm a Spurs fan, I can say that. Low block and then looking to counter, compared to your Liverpool, who are going to go and try and press you all over the field and go crazy. So in terms of the work you're putting the players through, particularly during this pre-season phase, etc., how much of that is in relation to the tactical and technical demands that the coach is putting in, and how do you factor that into this type of sessions you're delivering?
Yeah, so when I first joined here, I spoke to the head coach about what his philosophy was. I think that's important because when you polarize the physical with the technical and tactical, it becomes a reductionist approach. which maybe isn't the best approach. Some people might argue differently, but it's trying to integrate the two, and what style does he play? How does he see it? And how can I build that into the training? He spoke about the previous club that I was at and a pressing game that we played. And did you work on that in training? Yeah, we did, through small-sided games. Working in those small spaces, working on a press. I don't buy into. Maybe technical coaches will. I don't know, I was one once, but maybe they'll dismiss this. But I think every small-sided, medium-sided, long-sided game, there's a coaching opportunity. If you're working on negative transition, maybe, then you could put those into those small spaces. If you're working on transition through the midfield, or transition out wide, or whatever it is, you can then open that space out. What I think my role, or the way I see my role, is I will be able to say to the coaches, okay, don't let it run for 30 minutes, because the outputs will go through the roof. Give them adequate rest, and maybe do 8 to 9, maybe 10, whatever it is, quality repetitions to get that you're coaching in, but also be aware of the physical side of it. And it comes back to obviously what you're saying about Adam Owen, changing the space and time, and the relative playing area will influence physical outputs. So making the coaches aware of that, small possession drills where you don't really move anywhere. They don't particularly move anywhere. Rondos or whatever, they don't go anywhere. Open that out, that would change. If you're constantly switching play, then things are going to change. So I think you have to look at the game model, look at the physical outputs or the attributes of the players, and try and work out how you can complement that. Because the head of performance, director of performance, sports scientist, physical preparation, whatever title you've got, your job is to support the head coach and his game model, and then build your physical around that. I think it's got to be technical, tactical first, and physical gets built around that, because we have seen, I think one of the classic ones was the difference in Brendan Rodgers to Jurgen Klopp, and it's been quite well cited. Liverpool got a lot of injuries. After that, it's not knocking anyone at all, but Klopp played a completely different from a possession game to that high intensity, high press game. Are the players adequately prepared for that? So I think it's understanding your head coach's philosophy and how you build the physical around him, not just because you want to hit numbers.
And how do you differentiate from player to player or position to position? Because as you alluded to earlier, particularly if you're doing a high pressing example, your 9, your 7 and 11 are going to get through a lot of running, closing players down. Whereas, and I can say this because I used to be one, your slow plodding around centre halves might not be doing as much, but obviously being aware of the ball in behind. So how do you differentiate in terms of the sessions you're doing with the players to make sure that they're getting adequate loading for what they're specifically going to have to do during a game?
Yeah, I mean, so I've always, when I always talk to centre backs, they're the ones that maybe don't particularly take to the long sprints or high speed running. And I finished as a centre back, so the last thing you want is a ball popped in behind you. But what you'll say to them, what I've said to them is, actually, you may be exposed to that, so you need to train for it, because that may happen. It may not happen. Why do we expose players to above 90% of their maximum speed on a regular basis? Well, firstly, for hamstring health, but not just that, because they don't often hit their max speed, or they don't often hit over maybe 90-95% in a game. Suddenly, you need to be prepared for it if that happens. So that physical preparation is important. Positional is difficult, because we may rotate players in and out if we've concerns over someone. So we might say to the head coach, if you've got 2 in that position, just rotate them in and out rather than piling balls down the side for someone to run onto. So try and rotate players in and out. Do they need a little bit less? Do they need more? And then we'll take it from there on what their positional demands are. So one way of looking at it is across previous seasons, and trying to determine what that person is capable of. Because if you try and, sports science, we should use the scientific principles to push people as hard as they can. We should be pushing them to their limits and improving them. But you have to be respectful of the quick changes around in fixtures and position. The positional demands are changing. Sort of the dichotomy you have with that is that the women's game is not particularly well researched. There's a real lack of research. So a lot of data, and I was talking to a player about this yesterday, a lot of, if there is such a thing as normative data, you'd be looking at internationals because the international standard, their outputs will be higher. Conversely, it may be different with the US women's team because they're so much better than anyone else. And, you know, I would be fair to say that the quality opposition comes when they get into tournaments, maybe not so much in qualifying and friendly games. And that's not knocking any other nation. That's just the way things are. So I think trying to find positional averages can be difficult. But we have used international data and kind of seen that as a benchmark, because if you look at the success of the US women's national team, I think in 2019, and my good friend Dawn Scott, you know, they were streets above everyone else physically. You know, that was pretty clear. However, read the physical report of that, teams were catching up. So I think we're getting there in the women's game, but it's very, it can be difficult to determine, you know, positional averages, I guess.
I think that's interesting because obviously I saw in the media, and I can't remember the lady's name, unfortunately, but she transitioned from US soccer to the England team.
Dawn Scott, yeah.
And one of the things she said was they're not fit compared to the players that I've just been working with. They're not, even the top ones wouldn't be the top ones in the US ones. So I think that's a really interesting point you made there.
But then, and the argument, like, and we've spoke about this a lot here, the game in Europe is a lot more technical and tactical, whereas in the US, because of the college system, you know, the physical attributes, you're getting well-developed athletes when they, you know, maybe get a pro contract or should be well-developed. So it is different in that respect. But yeah, I certainly see what Dawn's saying, because, you know, there's no doubt about it. If you don't have the physical attributes, it could be difficult to play in the NWSL. It's a really physical league. So yeah, it's an interesting thing.
And in terms of like the loading, etc., you do, or the, you know, strength work that you do with them, is that position specific, or is that personnel specific, or is that body type specific? What does that look like in order to adapt from player to player or position to position?
Yeah, so I work closely with the director of rehab, and obviously herself and the athletic trainer will know everyone's injury history, and from there we'll try and almost reverse engineer. So the software we use for the gym program, I will put in the gym program maybe for the group, and then we'll discuss who needs modifying based on, you know, their physical capabilities and injury history. So it's collaborative that we can do that, which is, you know, it's a good thing that we have, that, you know, you've got a couple of different eyes who have a different opinion of what the players need to do, and because we all have access to the software, we can collaborate and change what we need to change based on that player, generally based on their physical attributes and their injury history.
Okay, and so with that in mind, I imagine with certain players, if they've been through a long period of being injured, your focus might be on actually just trying to maintain them not getting injured again, whereas someone who maybe has a really uncheckered past, you might be looking for improvements within certain areas or make them more durable or robust moving forwards. Yeah,
so if we use like the eccentric strength, the Nordboard and things like that, we can look at that, and that's a marker for us. And obviously eccentric hamstring strength, but little markers like that, we can see if someone's getting stronger based on the data we collect from the software in the gym. Where are they getting stronger? Do they need more? You know, because what you'll find again, there's that disparity in the athletes, that, you know, someone naturally is stronger than others, someone not. So where can we find those windows of opportunity and work with a player to increase performance, which is always our goal, or maintain health and increase performance. So a player that's a long-term injury, their program's going to be remarkably different, but they may be doing more in the gym than the playing squad on a time basis. So we try and find what is best for the group, but also what is best for the individual. So we're individualizing as much as we can based on what we know on the players, which again is something that may be very new to some players. So and new to us, if we don't know where the players straight out of college, we're not going to have a lot of information on them. So we have to try and use informed choices to make or informed decisions as to where to place that player. I think some people call it buckets, but is it more hamstring strengthening? Do they need more upper body strength? What does that player need? And how can we best track that and make changes where they need to be made?
And one of the things you alluded to earlier was kind of the players that go away on international duty and stuff. And so I looked through kind of your player list earlier, and you've obviously got some big names on there in terms of Megan Repinoe and Karen Bardsley and stuff, who's obviously in goal, etc. For players like that, who obviously, particularly for Karen, she's going to be flying back to the UK to play in fixtures if she's selected for England squads, etc. Or they're going to be going on camps and potentially in the World Cups or whatnot, playing a lot of games in a very short period of time. How do you prepare them physically for those tournaments or those flights or those deviants from a normal schedule? And how do you communicate that with national bodies to go, well, here's the data they're currently on, here's the things to be aware of, and I guess get informed of the data coming back so then you know where they're at when they return to you?
Yeah, we have good relationships with all the national teams. When a player's gone into a camp, they'll send us the data before they'll be looking at that data. So US Soccer have access to all our GPS. It's centralized. So they'll be able to see what a player's doing, and then we'll discuss that. The likes of Megan, who is obviously World Player of the Year, she'll be going off now to the Olympics. So again, that's incredibly collaborative because in the NWSL, those players are still owned by US Soccer, and they're allocated players to the teams. So we have to support, the US Soccer, and Canada is the same as well. So while the players training here, they don't really tend to interfere. But before we get into those periods of camps and tournaments, which I'm actually discussing someone this afternoon, is what is best and how can we adapt. We have the philosophy that, we have to, we also have our other players, and we try and integrate those players in with all of the sessions to get the physical outputs out of them and then top them up where needed. Because obviously the likes of US Soccer will want their player in they'll have certain criteria that they need that player to be in, and we'll try and facilitate that the best we can, as we do all the national associations. But I think that's an area that's really improved, especially in the US, and maybe that's due to the centralized contracts. But England, we'll speak to, when I worked at Utah, we had the Scottish captain, we had an Icelandic player, and they're all great. We've got some New Zealand internationals, or we had one at Utah, we have one now, Rosie White. They're great at sending us all the information. And then obviously we had a situation at a previous club where a player had flown 5 time zones, had played in international, their outputs were higher. And it was like, okay, we just need to speak to the player and maybe just give them an extra day off, see how they're feeling, just do something light, try and reintegrate them. We came to that decision at a previous club that, over certain times or periods, then that player should have, 24 to 48 hours off, because it can be easy to say, I'll just come into training, but then, your homeostatic or homeostasis is seriously disrupted, or circadian rhythm, even through jet lag. So there's going to be all kinds of things going on, and that is always the question: is that risky for the player? So yeah, there are things that we are, how many time zones is someone flying through? Where have they traveled to? How can we best integrate the player into training, but also advise them? Some of the international organisations or international organisations, they'll do that for us. I think the US players are pretty good. The likes of Megan, they're pretty good when they come back into training. They know what they need to do. So that's great. I think there's a lot of experience in that US squad, and they know their own bodies and they know what they need to do. And we just try and facilitate that with them so that we can have them back training for us.
And in terms of the Olympics, is that going to clash with your season, or is your season going to be done by the time the Olympics?
No, the league intend to keep running. There are a few US players now that are playing in the UK, Man City. It won't. The league will continue, but we won't lose that many players with the size of our squad. Some teams that have a lot more internationals will probably lose half their squad. So it's interesting because obviously it was put back a year and there's been a lot of uncertainty and, will it go ahead? Will it not go ahead? How are we going to facilitate this? I think it must have been frustrating for some players who have planned for last year. Everything is geared towards that, and then suddenly it's called off, and then you've got another year, and there's all that uncertainty and not playing games. But there might be a little bit of disruption, but I'm a bit biased to say that we've got a good squad that will be able to cope with it. So it's always an interesting time when you have a major tournament going on. The league runs, not so common in England or the UK because tournaments tend to be in the summer, so the league isn't on, whereas we're a bit different. That when I came here, it was on the back of the World Cup, so when I arrived here we still didn't have Utah with 3 US internationals, they weren't here when I arrived, so it was interesting.
So how does that work then? Because I'd imagine if you've got those internationals in place, the reality of the situation is, particularly if it's a World Cup, although they want to be integrated in the group and they want to, train and whatnot, there's also a point where their physiological needs and aim is going to be making sure they're in peak performance, ready to go over on the camp or ready for that tournament. So how do you manage that as a department in terms of the team needs and the performance aspect, but then also there's quite a high priority for them in a personal context and making sure that actually when you hand them over to US Soccer as part of those centralized contracts, as you discussed, they are at the physical levels that they should be?
Yeah, I think it's collaboration. It's, all being able to work together for the best interest of the player. The player's always central. So we'll always speak to them. We'll always try and speak to the player. How are you today? How is there anything we should know? Having good conversations with them to try and understand where they are, where they're at. Does the player need more rest? Can we try and obviously someone comes back the first day, you're not going to throw them in a load of tests to see how they are, depending on where they've just flown back from. We work very collaboratively with the international. You can look at it this way that, depending on where they are in the world, by the time they've actually flown back, they've probably had 3 or 4 days rest before they even come into training, with flights and everything else. So then the player might be good to train. It's unique and it's an individual, because out here on the West Coast, we're further than anyone else. I think that's in Portland. So we're further than anyone else. We could fly to Orlando for a game and that would, even New York, and that's a 5-6 hour flight for us, going through, to test my knowledge, I think 3, possibly 4 time zones. So we have to look at that and try and make some decisions on how we're going to work with the players to have them on the pitch. I think, it's been said a lot, but the most important ability is trainability, having them on the pitch, but we just need to work with the player and the international federations to make sure it's the right time for them. It might be that, again, it comes back to that thing. It may be that we need to modify some drills for them when they come back in. So
I'm going to pick up on something you said there. So regarding the different areas you travel to, how much does that lay plans to what you're doing as well? Because I'd imagine, for example,
New York during the winter period, freezing, covered in snow, might be winds howling all over the place. Go down to Orlando, lovely, by the beach, really humid, very hot.
Yeah.
You're going to have Denver, very high altitude, etc. How do you go around preparing the players to be robust when they're traveling all these different places to all different parts of the US that's going to present them with a variety of different physiological challenges?
Yeah, there's a lot of, we were at altitude in Utah, big discussion there about we also had altitude and heat. So, we knew there were certain changes that may occur in the athlete. I think you've got to, for an example, we played in Washington, it'll be 2019 now, and I'd never known humidity like it. By the end of the warm up, I was like, the sweat was pumping out of me, and I was just taking a warm up. You go down to Orlando, it's very humid. Utah, as I say, there's altitude and heat. So you try and look ahead and prepare for those things. Again, for us, that it's not like when you're in League Two, you might stay over the night before and then you travel back on a bus afterwards. We don't have that luxury. So what we may do is stay over, the day before a game. We may train. We might even go 2 days before a game. We might train in that area at the opposing club's facilities, and then we play a game that could be in the evening. Then the players are, for example, that same time in Washington, our game got delayed till 9:15 at night because of storms. Now, by the time we got out, it was 1 a.m. and we had to be at the airport for something like, 6:30 a.m. Which again, I think I remember saying to players, don't worry about submitting sleep data. I all know you haven't had any, because I didn't get any. So yeah, they are challenges. I think the more you know this league and the travel aspect of it, the more you can try and counteract things and find the what ifs, because there'll always be curveballs. I know we flew to Orlando in my first season here and got diverted to Atlanta due to a storm, because obviously you have storms and things like that. So I think you learn, certainly I've learned in the last nearly 2 years, like, where are we traveling? When are we traveling? Where are we staying? What facilities does the hotel, and how can we maximize that? So that when we used to come and play in Seattle, there was a small gym there. We would take the players into the gym, maybe some light stretching when we arrived, or whatever we needed to do with those players. Some places we go to, there was a pool, so we'll try and look ahead and think, okay, this is what we need to do, and adapt the best we can. Can we? And this is a discussion that comes up a lot, on the time zones. How do we try and stay in line with the natural body clock of players? I guess again, that's quite individual, and 2 hours ahead isn't that big. It's just like flying to Europe for a game, when you're probably getting to 5 hours ahead, or 6 hours ahead, or which would be Europe. Then yeah, you've got to start looking at that. So there are questions that we try to look at in advance and try and adapt the best we can.
And I guess for you, the travel thing must be one of the big things that you don't necessarily get in the UK. Obviously, you do get travel, but it will be, as you said, probably a bus there, a bus on the way back. And ultimately, if you're maybe excluding Plymouth, which it takes a bit of a distance to get anywhere. If you're Exeter, 5 hours, you're probably around the Manchester region, and you're going to be able to get to most games within that period. Whereas you said for those guys, you drive 5 hours in the US, probably not even out of state for a lot of places.
No, I drove up to here, Washington, from Utah. It was 14 hours. I got caught in a snowstorm in the mountains and nearly died. And I had to stop off one night, and it was just like, you've gone through 3 states, to get here. Beautiful drive, but I'm not sure I'd be keen to do it again. So people laugh at me here when I say, we would do bus journeys for like 9 hours. And they're like, where was that? I was like, it was just to Morecambe. Like, when you think of the size of England compared to the state of Texas. I think the travel one is, everything's a flight here, really. Portland is the nearest to us, which I think is 90 minutes, maybe a little bit more down the road. So that's a local one for us. But the travel when we go to the other side is different. So I think we obviously have a team administrator, general manager, and we'll try and work out what the best flights are for the players to get there, you know, and not have them up at 4:30 a.m. after a game. So we have to collaborate on that, because it's always about what's best for the players. You know, we know that from a recovery perspective, sleep is the best thing that we can do. So then we've got to look at, can we get later flight? Is that feasible? You know, and then you've got travel day, which, you know, you've not really done a lot. You know, do we need a day off after that? How far have we travelled? When's our next game? You know, so if you've got you could travel back on a Saturday night, or you could travel on a Sunday, you know, 6-7 hours. You could have a game on a Tuesday, and this is an example. How much training time have you got with those players? Now, that's a rare and extreme example, because in the times that has happened when we could travel, so 2019, basically, you possibly have a week on the road, and then you've got to adapt everything. But you know, we work with the nutritionist here as well, and certainly actually we started to Utah, and we will look ahead as to what you know, food is being provided, what recovery food we can work with the players. We, in the tournament, when I was at Utah, we used recovery packs that every player had after a game, you know, because sleep and nutrition are your two constants, really. You've got to get those right before you start doing anything else. So they're your big rocks and your low-hanging fruit. Get those right, facilitate the player in the best way you can to get those right, and then everything else sort of comes on top of it.
And how does the kickoff times affect you? Because I'd imagine, you know, if you've got a 12 o'clock kickoff in one time zone, but then in another one, which is plus or take 7 hours, it might end up being an 8 or 9 o'clock kickoff for you, your time. I'd imagine for a player's biological body clock, that's going to be challenging for them to adapt to when they feel like they should be ready to play and when they aren't. So how do you go around managing players in that context?
I think that's down to the individual. We're obviously here to advise them. You know, there is evidence about how many time zones to fly, and can you go to bed earlier the night before? Because obviously we're not going west, we're only ever going east. So when you're in the centre of the country, you may be going, or even the Midwest, you may be going east or west. So it's about being able to provide the player with the best evidence, evidence-based strategies that are going to help them. Generally, though, I haven't, I've never really found it much of an issue with the players, because sometimes we will travel, 2 days before a game to prepare. So you might have a travel day, then the next day you might train in the afternoon, and you have a game. You know, could train on a Thursday, fly on a Thursday, train on a Friday afternoon, and play a game on a Saturday. So either way, you're probably going to lose a day for the travel, depending on where you're going. And you know, you might train and travel, or you might travel and train at the opposition. But I also think the players are quite well accustomed to it here.
Yeah, not like us UK guys. If you start changing that time zones, you wouldn't know what's hit you for a certain degree.
Yeah, I think for me at the start, I was like, whoa. But you know, if you're 2 hours ahead or an hour ahead, it isn't. It's like flight. It's like going from London to Madrid, I think, is an hour ahead. You know, it is. You know, Champions League, they do it in and out in a day. You know, when you're getting over maybe a couple of time zones, that's a different ball game.
Yeah, and one thing I think is obviously very prevalent in the US is kind of the draft system, which is the ability for players to go through college and then obviously they get drafted to a team, etc. How hands-on, and I appreciate probably before COVID, how hands-on can you get with the players coming out of the college system, and how much in-depth data can you get? I know obviously the NFL level, they have the combines, they have pro days, etc., which allows scouts to go and watch them and whatnot. But in your context, how much data are you able to gather around these players to be informed when you are then looking to draft them?
Yeah, I mean, I've never really been involved in that because of the way it works. If I knew someone at one of the colleges, then maybe I would ask. But it's not something until we get the player in here, then we start to assess them ourselves. which I've always found strange. I must admit, I've found that different, but I haven't, in my time here, I've not had a university that I've contacted and said, or have even sent us any physical data on them. I did know one of the players that got drafted because I knew her college strength sports scientist, and he had texted me saying, this player is very good, and told me, but I'm not sure how common that is. And we do talk about that a lot, about shouldn't we be provided with injury histories, because it's almost a player has to come in and tell you everything. Of course, human nature is you're going to forget the ankle sprain that you had 5 years ago, 3 years ago in college, but that could have significant impact on your, if poorly rehabbed or whatever, on your movement patterns. And, so that could be difficult because you have to unravel it all. And, the players do have obviously medicals here when they arrive and the start of the season. So physicals and medicals. So we start to get that data in, but we don't actually get it until they're here. What's unique about this league is every team starts pre-season on the same day, across the league. So, there are times when you can and can't, you can and can't ask players to do things. And it's just the way things work here now. Players are excellent. They're really compliant with everything, but league rules do dictate what you can and can't do. So for an example, if the off season, which is a little bit shorter this year, but this year was probably one of the only years, because of the way the changes in contracts, that we can give them off-season work and track that across the off-season. Before that, you couldn't do that. From the minute players finished in, let's say, October, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't ask them to do anything until they arrived back in maybe March. So, which is unique, but generally players are very compliant. And when someone's been drafted, which is around about January, in my experience, we'll make contact with them and say, look, let's get going. But it is optional. So that's another.
I suggest if you've just been drafted or you're coming back for pre-season, you might want to get fit, because otherwise it's going to present some issues.
Yeah. And the college game is so different. It's like a 3-month season, whereas coming into full-time training and the intensity of that, then, it can be a little bit of a rabbit in headlights moment for the young rookie players, because like, whoa, gasping for air, because they may not have been used to that. So these are things that, we can monitor. And I think this is my second, I guess it's my third year in the league, really. Or 2.5, should we say. You get to know these things and understand them, because it is a different system, and certainly something I had to learn very quickly.
I think that's fascinating. Like I really like American sports. I watch NFL, watch NBA, all that type of stuff. And you think about the amount of data, even when you watch the combines and you watch the people in the Indianapolis Colts things, they're doing 40-yard dashes, they're doing bench press, they're doing movement drills, they're doing jump drills and stuff. So, and I always think that there's a game to be played where some people don't do it at certain times, don't do certain drills, but do it other times, because then they can up their scores and stuff. So the fact that you actually get very limited information in terms of data and in terms of particularly injury history, which again could be quite a severe one if all of a sudden this person's had 2 hamstring strains, and we're doing a lot of high velocity running. That's an issue which needs to be addressed. Yeah.
So then we have to, I guess, unpeel the onion and try and get to the bottom of it and try and work out, where this player is. But that comes from having robust systems in place for pre-season. How much information are you going to take in, or where you can get that information from. Obviously, the injury history is going to be through the person. And like I say, you can't remember every injury, but it may influence things. So we try and be as robust as possible and get as much information as we can from the player. And then once we start to do physical profiling and testing, we can see where that player's at. Like I say, coming from a college system to the pro game is so different. So I think you have to be patient.
In terms of your transition, working from men's game, moving into the women's game, in terms of biological differences or things that you've seen between the sexes, what things have really stood out to you, and what things maybe do the women's side do better than the men's side, or considerations they've had? Or is there anything that kind of really stood out to you in terms of learnings for you?
So, I mean, this question comes up all the time. There's obviously clear anatomical and biological differences. But I don't think that makes anyone less, relevant in, say, something like strength relative to that person, relative to the athlete. Absolute, of course, yeah. But relevant is different. I think when we look at thresholds of, say, let's say speed or high speed running, there's no definitive literature that says, you should use this threshold on a male or female, as far as I'm aware. So, maybe they're too high, sprint being over a certain velocity or speed, is that too high? I guess I can't answer that, but I think it can be a bit more tactical in the women's game, because people are still learning, so you'll get a much more, certainly coaches I've worked with tend to be more tactically orientated. But I wouldn't say I've seen any clear differences when I'm lucky enough in my roles in the US to work with the best players in the world. And that's not a grand statement, it's a fact. Multiple World Cup winners, Olympic medalists. So no, I think the easiest way is, apart from the biological and anatomical differences we were well aware of, no, I actually think the women's game doesn't get enough credit. That is changing. I think the 2019 World Cup was fantastic for the women's game, but in the UK, people really started to look at it and go, this is good. This is good to watch. So when you work with the 4 times World Cup winners, in the US, it's like, okay, these players know what they're doing. But I think, again, it comes down to an individual. They're still humans. They're just, women who play sport. I work with women who play sport. I don't work with women footballers. I work with women who play sport for their job. Same as when I worked with guys, just work with young guys who play football for a job. Now, obviously, you've got to be exceptionally good at it to get to that level, but there's still a human element. There's still human beings, and I think sometimes in the women's game, the women are a little bit more open and receptive, because I would say that the tide is changing a lot, and with Dawn going to England and some of the stuff they're doing over there with the regional talent centres, the female game is getting used to sports science and strength and conditioning now. In some countries 5 years ago, they weren't even interested. So I think the dynamics are changing, which is interesting.
Yeah, I see a lot more women's teams popping up in terms of, the professional clubs moving it either under their banner and taking over another team, or just investing more heavily on those areas, which I think is only a positive. And one thing I found fascinating watching the Women's World Cup 2019 from a tactical point of view, seemed like the US almost had, I guess, for an American term, power plays throughout the game, where it'd be like a first 10 minutes, it was flat out, we're going to press, we're going to be aggressive, then we might ease off into rhythm of the game. Another at 25, 5 minutes, flat out, ease off just before half time. It seemed like it was a concerted effort from the team to almost up the intensity, which I thought was a really interesting concept to how they used that to obviously do really well during specific periods within the games, which I imagine on a physiological level is probably something that they've prepared the players for that up and down trajectory.
Yeah, I think the work that they do and the work that they're doing at the moment is all geared towards the Olympics. It's all geared towards the World Cup. I think, for any player, your highest honour is playing for your country. But I think in the US, it's when you represent the USA, that's a big thing, and there's a lot of expectation on these players. They've got to go and win the Olympics. Canada might disagree with that because they're big rivals, or, other teams might disagree with that. But I think being in the USA and seeing it is expected that you win the Olympics. So you have that added pressure as well.
Okay, so talk about pressure. We'll discuss this quickly before I let you head off. Obviously, you mentioned with your PhD around pressures of, you know, multidisciplinary support staff in comparison to the players themselves. So from the research you've currently read and the research you've currently done, what at the moment are your key takeaways from those two areas with the people you've spoken to?
Yeah, well, so there's a real lack. I think there's only one, possibly two papers, maybe one, that actually looks at elite support staff. I think firstly you need to define elite, but they actually spoke to more performance directors than, you know, people on the ground. So one thing we noted was, and it wasn't my paper, by the way, it was Rachel Arnold's, but one thing that was noted was that the stressors, organizational stressors on elite staff are the same or similar to those of players. You know, pressure on contracts, you know, lifestyle influences to travel, all of that kind of stuff is factored in. And I think support staff can often maybe be a little bit forgotten about that. You know, there are clubs that, you know, some support staff are on almost football contracts as opposed to, you know, organizational contracts, if you want to differentiate between those two. So that adds stress onto the job and things that are going on. So I'm looking at it, you know, and sort of health and well-being. How good is it for or maybe not so good for the elite support staff, the environment that they're in, because you're always, you know, are you looking after yourself? You know, mental health is incredibly prominent now. It is a very intense and very chaotic environment. You know, I could be dealing with. Funny enough, I was listening to Frank Lampard talking on a podcast. Can't remember what it was, a few months ago, and he said that, you know, when he took over as manager, suddenly 40 odd people want his attention every day, and I was thinking that's no different to, you know, your performance director or your sports scientist or wherever, because you've got the players, you have the staff, you might have front office staff to deal with, you have suppliers, you have all of this going on, which adds to the stress of the job. So we're looking at it from that angle is, okay, if they're identical, then what can we do? We you know, we all want to look after our players, but what can we do to work with the elite support staff to support them? The other side to that is, like, does you know, the health and well-being of elite support staff contribute to success on the pitch? And that's an area, again, that's something we're exploring at the moment. I'm still in the very early stages of my PhD. So these are a lot of questions that are coming up that we're seeing. This is far broader than what we expected. And that's because it's hard because of the lack of research. But we're now starting to see, okay, so are we talking about support staff? Are we talking about support staff and players? Are we talking about the organisation as a whole? Because you know, if you work in the post office, there's a hierarchical structure, you know, from postman on the ground to manager to senior manager to whatever. You know, it's very structured that way. It's not like that in football organisations, sporting organisations, and sometimes it can be forgotten about that they are organisations. So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is sports psychology versus organisational or clinical are different things. Performance anxiety is different to clinical anxiety, of course. So can you support the support staff with organisational interventions or strategies, whatever way you want to look at that? Because is it more of an organizational thing or is it clinical or sports related? I would probably argue anecdotally that it's more an organizational issue. You know, we hear a lot about culture and, you know, and there's a lot of books written about it, which are great and I love them, but it depends what climate you're operating in. And if you're not operating in a climate that is supportive of a culture or driving a culture by daily behaviors and values and beliefs and everything else, then, you know, trying to implement something could go a little bit pear-shaped. So that's where we're at with it. Again, it's very early, but it's interesting that there's a lot of research in head coaches and coaching staff of, you know, their perceptions of stress and all the things that coaches go through, but there's just nothing in the support staff. Now, again, you've got to define support staff. Could you be encompassing physios and athletic trainers and, doctors and everybody else in there? And some research, you have to be critical, but some that I've seen doesn't really touch on the people that are on the ground. So that's where I'm going with it. It was just one of those things. I've been offered PhDs in physiology, which I would argue is more my area. And I saw this one and I thought, you know what, that's an area that's just not been looked at. I haven't been in this environment for many years now. I think it's made me look at things from a different angle, certainly the psychological side of it. So it's, like I say, it's early days, but, I've had 2 long meetings today with the university about where we're going with this and what we and how we can impact through research. And I think that's the underpinning thing. How can we impact? You'll hear that Google and these companies talk about how they work with their employees, and then your support staff are still employees. So as much as coaching staff and players. So it's trying to find out. I think it's interesting that the one paper that's out there does make to show that there is the same organisational stresses on players as there are as support staff.
Listen, I could sit and talk about this all day, and I think it might be we've not touched on a lot of your experiences and whatnot, but I think time's obviously closely closing in on us. So I think that might be for another podcast when maybe further down the line we can go into it more. The one question that I have for everyone, and this could prove quite challenging for you, which is who's the best player you've worked with or against, or who's the best coach you've worked with or against, and why?
Oh, well, I don't think I can answer that. I would say every coach has taught me something different. Every coach has taught me something different. It would be hard to say, every player has taught me something different. You're constantly learning. So I wouldn't want to name names as such, because that would be unfair. I've learned from everyone. What I will say is I was very, very lucky at Celtic when Brendan Rodgers was there and his staff, and I think they helped me understand sort of a tactical periodization and that side of it. Well, I wouldn't say it's true to Friday's work, but it's started to make me think about the holistic side of things in player physical development, if you want to put it that way. So that was a real, and I've said it a few times, that was a real key influence to me, Brendan and all his staff, some who are still there and everybody at Celtic, but the other coaches that I've worked under have all had different philosophies, different views, different ways of using sports science. And from that, I think I've really learned from everyone. It would just be so difficult because I've been blessed to work with so many world-class players. From players, in fact, players I work with at Exeter have now gone on and made full international debuts and playing in the Premier League. That's rewarding for me you've had like a 0.5% influence in their career, but I find that more rewarding. So I wouldn't be able to put it out there. I just couldn't pick someone. I say I've had influences and I spoke there, but no, it's difficult to answer.
No, that's fine. Listen, Andrew, I really appreciate your time and loads of amazing content there. And as I said before, I think definitely if you're up for it at some point, we can get in touch again in the future and have another sit down, because we haven't gone into half of the experiences and whatnot you've had. So it'd be great to have you back on.
My pleasure. I look forward to it.
Speak to you soon.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.